This presentation is part of the TI in Focus AP Calculus video series. In this video, I'll discuss the scoring guidelines for the 2019 AP Calculus exam, free response question AB1 BC1. My name is Steve Kokoska. I'm a professor at Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania, and I'm a former AP Calculus chief reader. Here's an outline of the information presented in this video. I'll start by reviewing the free response question and then the scoring guidelines used at the AP Calculus reading in Kansas City. I'll present a brief general summary for student performance on this question, and then I'll consider more detailed interpretations of the scoring guidelines and how these guidelines were applied in certain situations. I'll consider some common student errors where it's relevant, and if it's appropriate, I'll present some specific scoring examples. This question involved fish entering and leaving a lake. We're given the rate at which they enter the lake and the rate at which they leave the lake. There is no initial condition given here, so we don't know the initial number of fish in the lake. Part A asks for the number of fish that enter the lake over a 5-hour period. Part B asks for the average number of fish that leave the lake over the same 5-hour period. In Part C, we need to find the time at which the greatest number of fish are in the lake over the interval 0 to 8. And finally, in Part D, we need to determine whether the change in the number of fish is increasing or decreasing at time t equal 5. Part A was worth 2 points. The first point was for writing the definite integral that represents the number of fish entering the lake from midnight to 5 a.m. And the second point, found using technology, was for the answer. Note that this question asked for an answer to the nearest whole number. Part B was also worth 2 points. The first point was for presenting the definite integral as part of the average value calculation. And the second point was for the answer, the average number of fish that leave the lake from midnight to 5 a.m. And this answer must be correct to 3 decimal places. Part C was worth 3 points, and there were 2 common solutions presented in the scoring guidelines: a sign test approach and a candidates test approach. Both were scored according to these guidelines. 1 point for setting E of t minus L of t equal to 0, 1 point for the answer, and 1 point for sufficient justification. Here's the solution using the candidates test. Part D was worth 2 points. The first point was for considering both E prime of 5 and L prime of 5. And the second point was for the answer with a sufficient explanation. Here are some general comments about student performance on this question. In Part A, most students knew that they had to evaluate this definite integral, and most knew to use their graphing calculator. Some students did not round to the nearest whole number, as indicated in the question, but those that did not at least followed the 3 decimal place rule. There were some common notational errors here, and here are 2 of them, and both of these were overlooked under the pressure of a high-stakes exam. Unfortunately, some students simply evaluated E of 5, and some students interpreted E of t as an amount rather than a rate, and this led to attempts at and use of a derivative. In Part B, most students knew they had to evaluate this expression, and this answer had to be presented to 3 decimal places. But unfortunately, some students presented 6.06, or just plain 6. And some students found an average rate of change, and some found an arithmetic mean of 5 or 6 values. In Part C, many students knew that they had to determine where E of t minus L of t changed signs, and many were indeed able to solve this equation successfully. However, some students found the maximum value of E of t, and some students found the maximum value of E of t minus L of t. And some students presented only a local argument as justification. In Part D, most students considered the value of E prime of 5 and L prime of 5. However, some students considered E of 5 and L of 5 instead. And there were some common notation errors here that were overlooked. And here's one misuse of notation in Part D. And some students simply presented incomplete explanations. Now, let's take a more careful look at the scoring guidelines. And remember, this was a calculator active question. The first point in Part A was for presenting the definite integral that represents the number of fish entering the lake over the time interval 0 to 5. And the student must explicitly write this definite integral, but will not be penalized for omitting dt. In the student's presentation, we must be convinced that they are using only this definite integral to produce an answer. And that means there can be no additional parts to the integrand or extra constants. And if the student actually tries to write out the expression for E of t and makes a copy error, they can earn the first point, but not the second. The second point in Part A was for the answer. A bald answer here does not earn the point, and that means it's an answer without any supporting work, which in this case is the definite integral. We will accept either 153 or 154, and a non-integer answer can still earn the point here. However, the answer must be correct to the number of decimal places presented, well, up to 3. And this kind of sequential or linked rounding was common and was not penalized. Now, unfortunately, some students clearly had their calculator set to degree mode, and we had a very fair method for recognizing this error and for scoring subsequent work appropriately. Part B was worth 2 points. The first point was for presenting this definite integral as part of the calculation for the average value. The constant in front, 1/5, is considered part of the answer point. And there can be no other integrals or constants involved in the calculation, similar to Part A. And if the student mistakenly computed this definite integral in Part A, they may import this value into Part B in order to find the average value. The second point in Part B was for the answer, and the average value must be presented here to at least 3 decimal places. If the student incorrectly presents just 6 here, this is considered a decimal presentation error, and they don't earn the point. Part C was worth 3 points. The first point was for setting E of t minus L of t equal to 0. Well, more generally, there must be an attempt to determine where E of t minus L of t changes sign, or where the graphs of E of t and L of t intersect. Now, this idea can be expressed in words by the student, and here's an example. And in Part C, the words functions and equations are assumed to mean E of t and L of t. However, the word graphs, without specifying which graphs, is considered ambiguous. The second point in Part C was for the answer, and we will accept the value of t rounded or truncated to 3 decimal places. Now, it's possible for the student to earn the second point here without the first, that is, without conveying the mathematics that leads to the correct value of t. So here's an example of how a student might earn 0, 1. The third point in Part C was for the justification, and there were 2 common student responses here. The first involved the sign test approach. We must be convinced that the student is presenting a global argument, and here's an example of how they can do so. However, the endpoints do not need to be included in the intervals. but remember, a sign chart is not sufficient justification. If a student uses the candidates test approach, which by the way is the way that I solved the problem, the actual table of values is the justification. Now, we'll ignore claims about the function a of t representing the total number of fish in the lake, because we don't have an initial condition here in this problem. However, values of a of t must be correct to the number of decimal places provided or presented up to 3. And a of 0 equals 0 does not need to be included in the table of values. Part D was worth 2 points. The first point was for a consideration of, or for knowing, that we need to use e prime of 5 and l prime of 5. And the general philosophy in awarding this point is that we must be convinced there is a reasonable attempt to use these two values. The student may attempt to find these two values symbolically, and this earns the first point. If these values are presented without any symbolic work, then at least one must be correct. If the student goes directly to the difference of the two values, then the difference presented must be one of these two values. And these 3 values do not need 3 decimal places. These aren't final numerical answers. The second point in Part D was for the answer with a sufficient explanation. And the student must make a connection between e prime of 5 and l prime of 5. And any reported values here, however, must be correct. However, the values don't need to be reported. At the AP Calculus reading, an actual briefing for the scoring of a free response question usually takes approximately 75 minutes. And there is also time allotted in the reading rooms for discussion before the actual scoring begins. However, I hope this summary video gives you a good idea of how this question was scored. And just a reminder, there are lots of valuable resources on the TI website. There is material there involving technology and calculus, classroom activities, and lots of calculator tips and tricks for test success.